Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is the fourth episode in the series, What Makes Marriages Work. In this episode, Dr. Scoresby talks about why communication is an essential part of human relationships, types of communication to avoid, and the kind of communication found in healthy relationships. Visit mattersmostmedia.org to find more about the podcast and firstanswers.com to find tons of relationship resources.
I have often heard someone explain a problem by saying, "We just have a communication problem," as if it's a minor thing. I've often reflected on that a little, realizing that in some ways, communication is all that we have. So having a problem with it is not minor at all. I hope to explain why communication is so important. And in this lesson, I'm going to provide examples of how communication has considerable influence in our lives and why it is an essential part of human relationships. I'm also going to describe some of the worst forms of communication and then emphasize what excellent communication is and how to improve it. Sometimes people who are in a work, family, or friend relationship think it's possible to not communicate. They believe that not talking is a way of not communicating, or withdrawing from others does not communicate. In short, the idea is that not sending any messages or creating distance or spending time away from one another is a way to avoid communicating. Although many try this, it does not work because not sending any message at all or creating distance does in fact communicate a very significant message. One of the most significant principles that has emerged from communication research is the idea that when people have any form of relationship with one another, everything may be a message. Withdrawing from someone communicates, distance from someone communicates, and does so as much as if we are face-to-face trying to talk to each other. Therefore, it is not possible to not communicate, and the only alternative we should select is to learn how to be very successful with it. Let's begin by addressing this question: how does communication exert influence in our lives? Well, first of all, families actually establish a sort of code from which all children learn. They may expand this code by their reading and learning, but the way families communicate is often carried through generations. How open and talkative a family is, how much they talk, what about and to whom, and it can have a major impact on family members. An example of this is the research of the anthropologist Basil Bernstein from England. He examined school children and their families and the style of communication that occurred in each families and the role in achieving in English primary schools. He went to the schools and asked the headmasters there to identify the top 25 and the bottom 25% of school performers. Then he went into the homes of these children and asked them the same question: "Please explain what you tell your children about school." He recorded the parents' answers and counted the number of words. He found that some parents communicated in an expanded version of communication, and other parents communicated in a restricted code of communication like "be quiet, stop that, shut up," and so on. Then when he went back and compared the students' response and to the achievement opportunities in school, he discovered that a much higher percent of the successful academic children came from homes where the parents used an expanded form of communication. A little thought will indicate to you that how we communicate with our children may, in fact, give them a sort of attention span. And if we are talking and explaining to our children, then they tend to listen for longer periods of time. If we're using two-word sentences, it is likely that the children's attention span will be much shorter. I once tried an experiment when I was observing a teacher to see how long a typical teacher talks at any one time, and it's several seconds typically, which means that for the children who came from the restricted code families, the teacher actually went past their attention span in a very short period of time. Another example of how communication influences has been presented by the research of Benjamin Whorf, who studied about the role of the environment in developing our vocabulary. He indicated, for example, that in Eskimo language there are 52 words for snow and ice. And then in the contiguous 48 states, he asked the same question: what topic do we have the largest vocabulary about? He found out that it had to do with cars, and the reason for that is 1 in 7 people in the United States work in an industry that's related to automobiles. But then Benjamin Whorf went on to suggest something else. It's astonishing, and it's an interesting idea. He said that if you don't know the word, then you might not see the event or the object in the environment. Now think about that just for a minute. In order to communicate well, then, we would need to develop a vocabulary for the situation or relationship we are in. So if you are a father or mother, for instance, it would be a very good thing if you learn to use words that describe your roles as parents. Some examples include patience, disciplining, preparing kids more than punishing them, communicating more than you control them, encouraging them more than criticizing them, love enough to set and keep good limits, and individualizing them and involving them. These are words that represent events that good parents do to rear successful children. If you wish to communicate to a spouse, then it is useful to know words that describe communication in marital relationships such as the language of love, kindness, support, sacrifice, emotional intimacy, decision-making, negotiating, problem-solving, expressions of hope and encouragement. Now let's suppose that you concentrate on your work. This idea also makes a great deal of sense to leaders and team members at work who must learn the vocabulary for the setting in which they work. Think about vision, stand-up meetings, executive huddles, strategy, goals and objectives, sales process, many different types of reports, year-to-date reports, definitions of good worker and a good colleague, and crucial times of the month or your year for your supervision, leadership, and teamwork. So why is communication then so important to human relationships? Some of the reasons may surprise you. You may be acquainted with the idea that accurate communication increases the possibilities that people will correctly perceive each other and therefore like each other better, or that through communication people can solve problems, create connections and intimacy, and generate interest in one another. And it's also possible that clear and accurate communication may destroy relationships. But what we're really interested in is finding the stimulus or the ties that make relationships attractive. But there is much more than this. In our relationships, communication satisfies the affiliation need. The desire to be with people typically produces a motivation to communicate, and then through communication we satisfy it. Communication helps us understand what things mean in the world. What that means is how do we understand what people do, what governments do, what newspapers do, what politicians do, what people in our friendships do. Happiness and security for all of us depends on us accurately interpreting people in the world in which we live, and we do that through communication. Nowadays, we are getting a lot of communication, so much so, for example, that several years ago, a Harvard University professor said, "We are drowning in a sea of information, that is communication, and we're starving for knowledge." And the point he was making is that he would like communication that communicated more about real things, real essential things, part of life. Communication also helps each person understand others, and including themselves. There are human conditions like motives, intentions, desires, interests, and hopes that can only be understood through the sharing of information, and good communication asks about that. We like to understand what motivates a person, what their intentions are, and in order to find out, we usually ask a question and therefore communicate about it. Communication also enables the establishment of a positive identity, where individuals come to see who they are, what they are like, their talents, abilities, and how and why they are unique from others. It is also, therefore, obviously true that some forms of bad communication can prevent a positive identity from emerging in the lives of our children or in our adults. For example, in an early family where communication is tragically lacking, or there's an abandonment and a failure to communicate, quite often children suffer from understanding themselves and knowing how to live their lives in a positive way. Communication also allows us to join together, to display leadership and forge public opinion. We can watch that happen through several means. One of the most dramatic examples of that is when a an army officer or when a leader in a business or in a church or some other place wants to inspire people, they typically will resort to certain kinds of motivational speaking or a form of communication that activates people's feelings. Communication contains the information, and this information is the lifeblood of any relationship. And so we should carefully learn what poor or inadequate communication is like and then avoid it. Plus, if we learn how to be good at it, we can conclude that we might make our own lives better, including our relationships with other people. Frankly, a lot of the ineffective communication behavior has been brought to light by the electronic devices that so many people use nowadays, because it provides an opportunity for them to be indifferent to somebody who is speaking. If we're going to organize just a set of examples of what makes communication inadequate, we would include the following: not attending to somebody while they're speaking, being indifferent, looking away, being focused on something other than what the person is saying. Computing may be new to you, but it's a form of communication that indicates that we're sort of not interested in the person. We just want to pay attention to the fact of the case. So a woman might go to her husband and say, "I'm feeling depressed." And if he's computing, he would say, 37% of the women in America are depressed. And then he would give some observation about how she should cure it. Well, that's computing, and it's poor communication because it ignores the person. All he would have to say is, "My goodness, sit down. Please tell me about it." Another form of ineffective communication we know of is defending. When a person gets defensive, it means that they have fear in their communication, and so their brain automatically does the following. It edits the message that a defensive person sends. It doesn't receive or hear the messages other people say accurately. And in the process, a defensive person becomes unable to send accurately, to receive accurately, and it increases the likelihood of a continuation of mistakes in judgment about themselves and other people. History giver is another example, where if somebody will say, "What do you think about that?" the individual will go into a lengthy history that explains the background of the answer before they give the answer. And by the time you listen to the history, you've forgotten what the question was. Here's another one, an evidence user. Sometimes we're apprehensive about the answer we want to give or the statement we want to make. So before we make it, we give all sorts of evidence. So-and-so said this, I read this in a book, it was in the newspaper, and then we make our own opinion. And in the process, we've lost the person that we're trying to communicate with. Another form is more subtle, ignoring emotional cues. When somebody has strong emotions on their face or in their nonverbal behavior, ignoring them means that we're essentially ignoring half the message or more that this person is trying to communicate. There are many instances where people fail at that. Men quite frequently are the ones who are blamed for that, but I've seen it in both males and females where we'll pay attention to a statement that somebody makes, interpret it in some way, and ignore the emotions that are behind it altogether. Another form of ineffective communication is called deflecting. And when someone asks a personal question like, "What do you think about this?" or "What's your opinion?" you deflect away by saying, "I was talking with a friend in a nearby city, and here's what this person said." So we just deflect away from ourselves, and it is often the case when we pay a compliment. "You look really pretty today, Marie." And then the woman has a hard time with that and says, "Well, most women do," or we'll go on to something else so she doesn't have to respond because it's a little difficult. Over-talking is another one. When I'm anxious, for example, I might talk more than I should. I might say more things. But that by itself is a message. So if I'm over-talking and I'm in a conversation with someone, it probably means that I'm anxious or I'm trying to appease my guilt or not communicate some significant emotional message. One of the most common errors of communication is interrupting while someone speaks. The idea that I interrupt you, unless there's an essential reason and an apology for that, actually means I think what I have to say is more important than what you're saying. And if you allow interrupting to occur in your family, then gradually what will happen is the children who are interrupted will come to believe that their ideas may not be as crucial as someone else's. Here's another example of poor family communication. You talk for somebody else and you. For example, Billy and I are hungry, Mom. Can we have something to eat? And if a parent allows the child to talk for the other child, eventually one child will be quiet and won't know for sure what his opinion is. It is also the case that scapegoating is an interesting form of bad communication. We explain my actions by using somebody else. Well, the reason I'm doing this is because you, or I did this after you did that. And the simple truth is that in human communication, the person who speaks first is often considered to be the cause of what person number two says. Well, it's not true. It just means that that person spoke first. But the second person uses that to say, well, you've caused me. I'm doing what you're doing. I'm saying what you're saying. And a better way to deal with that is just simply to say, look, here's what you said. Here's what I said. Now let's go back and get it right. Lastly, and there are many, is patronizing, is where one person communicates to the other that somehow they're less valid, less important, less significant, and they do this in a manner that is a standard quite often, and they do it with people and actually injure people and their relationships. So these are examples of the kinds of things to avoid, and I'll try to give examples of them later on when I explain what to do to improve your relationships by improving your communication. After identifying several forms of ineffective communication, let's turn to understanding what good communication is. And there are two essential parts that I would like to focus on. One is the idea that in every message there's actually three parts. One is the meaning of the words that are used. Two is the underlying emotions that are involved. And three is the situation or the context in which this communication takes place. Good communicators will understand all three. The next time you're in a conversation with some person and you are in an environment that allows you to experiment, ask a few open-ended questions like, I would like to know about, or what do you think about, or can you tell me? And then finish your sentence with something you'd like to know. Then practice summarizing the meaning of the words that the person says in response to your question. What you are saying is, and then do your best to find the underlying feelings. Like, for example, it seems like you're excited about that, or happy, or sad, or whatever. And then ask about the situation or the context, and say something like this. And so you see yourself in this situation, and so you're identifying all three. Now practice doing that so your mind will actually identify these three parts. The meaning of the words, the underlying emotion, and the circumstance or the situation that the person is referring to. It will significantly improve your ability to listen and to understand somebody when you're being spoken to. The second element of good communication is brought to us by Noam Chomsky, a noted American linguist who separated communication into two parts. He indicated that the surface structure, or the most obvious form of communication, is the grammar and the meaning of the words. He also indicated that there was a deep structure of language which combines the words and the context or the situation. Now listen to this sign that someone saw on a restaurant wall. If you think this service is bad, see the head waiter. Now think about that for a minute, because the words are exactly the same. That's the surface structure. The deep structure is, if you think this service is bad, then see the head waiter. Or you might notice that there's a sign on another wall that says, please do not hang signs on this wall. And you look at the sign, notice what it says, and you're thinking, well, what is the meaning of all of that? Remember this communication rule. It is not only not possible to not communicate, but it is also the case that people communicate for a purpose, and they will use the surface structure and the deep structure to communicate what their purpose is. People want something when they talk. You can improve your communication by making what you say satisfies this rule. I am sending this message to you for this purpose. When you listen, you can respond by saying, well, I hear you saying this, and I think your purpose is, and then you could state the purpose. Now that's a little formal and awkward, and so you wouldn't do it all the time, but if you practice just a little bit, you can eventually train your thought process to speak clearer and understand more accurately. Now, when we take these two parts of good communication, the three parts of every message, and the surface and the deep structure, we can in fact identify for each relationship we're in something called crucial conversations. Crucial conversations are the types of conversations or communication that are essential to make a certain kind of relationship work. Since I'm focused some on marriage relationships, I'm going to use marriage relationship as an example to identify some crucial conversations. So here's the first one. It's a casual conversation about any idea that just allows us to talk and visit and enjoy and tell stories and so on, because the idea that we can talk free from pressure and stress indicates something about our relationship, but it also allows us to more accurately communicate nonverbally. A great deal of communication is nonverbal, such as gestures, while speaking will tell us how emphatic the speaker is, body posture will tell us about how intense the person is, and physical proximity will tell us about the person's intentions. Most of us understand that to discover what someone is feeling, we will need to look at the person's facial expressions, and we can get better at that by making polite observations to see if we are correct. It is also true that healthy communication exists during these casual conversations when the words we use match the feelings we feel. This is called congruence. When this does not happen, a listener may not know what is wrong but will suspect something. Practice trying to find the exact words that match the feelings you're feeling while you're speaking. Another crucial conversation for marriage is called we know it as a DTR, or an evaluation of what the relationship is like. What we really want to do, however, is to find out about the current relational conditions, such as, what are your expectations? What feelings have you been feeling lately? What are your desires? What kind of goals do you have in mind? Where would you like to go? Now, why do we want that information? What's the purpose of it? It's to find out about each other so that we know how to adapt or adjust ourselves going forward into the future. These types of relationships that allow us to find out expectations are often very successful ways to resolve some problems. Next time you have a disagreement with your partner, just simply say, what are your expectations here? Or I'd like to know what you desire in your communication. What are your goals here? And find out what each person wants. It'll surprise you how often we misinterpret these notions, and we can get accurate information when we clearly ask about expectations, feelings, and desires. Another crucial conversation is the language of intimacy and the language of understanding. It's a really important skills to be able to, through communication, to draw yourself close to somebody, to help them feel comfortable when they're talking with you. And this is such an important reward for a married couple, that those who really can master this form of communication also have a more successful relationship sexually and emotionally. It's fairly easy to identify the kinds of communication behavior that's part of it. It includes self-disclosing, that is, telling about yourself without any blame or accusation, just simply telling about, this is what I'm thinking and feeling and so on. The rule about self-disclosure is this: it takes two people to see one. And when a person is talking about herself and the other person is an attentive listener, asking questions and so on, eventually the person who is talking about herself will discover new things and new ideas and will begin to say, well, no, here's what I really mean, or this is what I thought, or this is what I'm going to do. It's a very powerful form of listening, but it's also a very powerful form of learning to communicate, to talk about yourself in some ways. There are many married people, for example, who are in a barren relationship because one or both people cannot do that. They don't know what they think about. They don't know what they feel like. And so when they talk, they have a difficult time communicating, and therefore the language of intimacy and the language of understanding tends to suffer. Besides self-disclosure, the language of intimacy and understanding includes making a great effort to understand the total message someone wants to send so that understanding takes place. This refers back to those three parts. I want to understand the meaning of your words. I want to identify and understand the underlying feelings, and I'd like to understand the situation or the context or the circumstance that you're describing. Making an effort to do that sometimes is difficult and might not even be successful, but the effort will be rewarded by appreciation. And last, language and intimacy understanding includes hopefulness, the idea that after we go through this process, I'm going to hope for something positive that's going to happen, and this language actually produces hope by communicating that things will get better if they haven't been better. I feel closer to you and now I feel safer. I can communicate about myself, and so the trouble I was feeling now is understood by another person, so I feel more support. It lifts and it builds, and it's a wonderful idea to be good at the language of intimacy and understanding. The next crucial conversation I would like to propose that is important in marriage is the decision-making conversation. Part of being married pertains to selecting goals and outlining strategies for attaining them. This process is called decision-making, and its importance is revealed both in the positive benefits that occur when it is conducted effectively and in the unhappiness that ensues when it's not. Good or bad, decision-making has a considerable impact on any relationship because it signals how the two people organize themselves in sharing their lives. It is in the making of these decisions that gives evidence of our capacity to jointly create, to produce, and to fulfill. I can think of numerous instances where problems and conflict that people have endured sometimes for several years exists because of their difficulty in making good decisions together. And quite frequently, the reason they don't make good decisions is because they either don't know or they don't have a jointly agreed upon method for making decisions. So they'll talk, visit, and so on, and maybe think a decision has been made, and then discover that one person saw the example different than the other and didn't follow through or didn't do something, and then this leads to another discussion, sometimes a source of frustration. And all that needs to happen is for the couple to sit down and say, okay, now let's go through decision making, learn the parts of making a good decision, and then identifying the sequence that we go through so that from the beginning to the time when a decision is made and we agree on it. I'm going to first describe 5 different types of communication and explain what they mean and how to use them, and then I'm going to apply them in a sequence of stages so that you can see how you can start, get to the middle stage, and then come to the end part where a good decision is made and both people are confident that they can go forward trusting that a decision is made and they know what to expect. So here are the 5. The first one is called pacing. And pacing means that both people learn to participate at roughly the same way. That is, one person doesn't overtalk the other. One person doesn't act quietly or passively. Both people share their opinions. Both people pace themselves in terms of the amount they talk. 2, clarifying. Clarifying simply means that during a decision making, we want to increase the attempts to say, please tell me what you mean by that. Please clarify that so that I understand it. Or, I didn't make myself really clear, so could I go back and redo that? So besides clarifying, we have something called tentativeness. Tentativeness means that we enter the decision-making conversation with some idea of what we'd like to see or some idea of what we think the decision ought to be, but it's expressed tentatively because if you start the discussion by being extremely absolute or rigid, then it tends to communicate that if somebody disagrees, then we're going to have an argument. So tentative means, well, here's what I'm thinking, but there might also be other possibilities, or I've tried to look at several options, and this is what seems to me at this point in time to be the very best. And what you're doing is saying, I'm tentative, and therefore there's room for you. 4th is called integrating. Any good decision will require that we take each person's ideas and integrate them and put them together in some way where we can identify the commonalities. So it's a real skillful person who will say, well, I can see where the two of us are like on this point, or we will both want that part, and we might differ here, but we want this, or what matters really to me is that we come up with a decision that both of us can feel pleased with. Number 5 is that we're going to make reference to and be concerned about the other person. So while you're making a decision, you often want to say, look, what's important to you here, and why is it important? So you move away from the steps of decision making or the issue that you're trying to decide, and you make pointed, personal, and kind reference to be concerned about your partner. You need to make sure that I want to be concerned about you, I care about the outcome, and that actually enables and encourages people to go forward till they reach a good, solid decision. So a quick review. Here are the 5 parts. Pacing, where you communicate or send messages about the same length. 2, clarify. Increase clarifying so that you make sure you understand each other along the way. 3, be tentative. Tentativeness communicates there's room for you. Come and share your ideas. And 4, integrating. Let's start putting our ideas together and see how things work out. And 5, I want to be concerned about you. I am as concerned about you as I am the issue we're trying to decide. Now let's take a look at the decision-making conversation as a series of 3 stages. The first one is called the entry stage, and in this stage we want to find out and reach agreement about what it is we're going to decide. The simplest way to do that is to say, what do you want here? Or what do you think we should be concluding? What is your view? So when one person asks that, and then you hear a response from the other, then it's good partnership for the other person to say, now I want to know what you want or what is important to you. Have a discussion, clarify it, pace, be tentative about that, and then you can come to some agreement that this is what we're going to decide. When you've reached an agreement about what we're going to decide, then you have the entry stage completed. In the middle stage of decision making, we want each person's preferences or what he or she wants to be matched with some options, some alternatives. So someone just has to say, well, what are our options? What are things we could decide? For several years, I tended to start making my own decisions by assuming that there were just 2 alternatives. And it was a great discovery for me as a young man, I discovered that there are probably many more than I thought. I just needed to spend more time to search for and find them. So we have a discussion. What do you think are the alternatives? What options do you see? Then you link them back to the personal preference. Which of these do you prefer? Because if it's possible, we want to satisfy each person's preferences. A decision may actually have to be made, which neither one of us prefers, or there may be sufficient evidence to support that something is going to take place or need to take place that doesn't satisfy one of us this time. But if possible, we want to emphasize personal preferences so that we can make a good decision based on the idea that we each are trying to satisfy what each person wants. The final stage of decision making, of course, is to specify what the decision is. Now, it's important to do this because if you've had any experience doing this as a married person, you probably know that quite often, or at least on several occasions, somebody has made a decision. We thought it was a decision, only it turned out that the person meant something else. So you want to make sure at this time, now let's go over what the decision is. How do you see it? Here's what I see it. So we can agree that this is the decision we've made and this is where we're going to go. Now, if you can do that, and do it politely and respectfully, you'll be perceived as somebody who just cares about your relationship, moving it forward to carry out the decisions you've made. I repeat, decision-making in marriage is how we join ourselves. It's how we exercise good leadership. It helps us both feel productive, and it enables us to feel like we can solve the problems we might be facing, and it encourages us to go forward with a sense of faith and hope. The next crucial marriage conversation that I wish to describe is called negotiating. And you might wonder why the word negotiating is used where marriage is concerned, because it usually is applied to, say, making business deals of some kind. But the truth is that married people negotiate many different things. They negotiate how each person carries out their gender role, What is the way for a man to behave or a woman to behave? How do we negotiate how we each take care of household chores or manage our children, and numerous other forms of situations where two people need to come together in an agreeable way. So negotiation, like decision making, turns out to be fairly crucial to a successful marriage. And those people who negotiate well will be able to not win all of the time, but they will negotiate well and create unity that both people are highly satisfied with. In recent years, for example, one of the sources of conflict between married people had to do with who performed household work. And this was because in previous decades, there was a much greater separation based on sex roles where women worked hard at home, being a domestic person, and men went off to work somewhere else and provided a living. Well, these gender roles, of course, over the years have been altered considerably, but as it turns out, old habits die hard. And so quite frequently, a woman might go to work and come home and still be expected to take care of household chores and manage the children, etc. Well, this caused some difficulty, of course, and so both men and women need to go through a negotiation process where they can make adjustments in their roles that are more satisfactory. When this happens, men discovers that there are a lot of benefits in being a homebody some of the time, so that they get access to their children. They learn to understand more about the practicalities of life, and women find enjoyment because then they don't have to do all of the work during their daytime job and when they get home in the evenings. So here are the principles of good negotiation. A good negotiator will identify the nature of the problem or the idea that they would like some resolution to. Then have that talked about. So it's clarifying what the problem is or the outcome we'd like to achieve. In this case, a woman might say, I would like to see a much better balance between what you do and what I do in terms of keeping the house clean or getting chores done here. So I'd like to work something out where we can manage that. Or we might come up with a different financial management arrangement, who pays the bills, etc. So we're going to identify that. Then the next question has to do with, again, what is your preference? What is it you want? What would you like to see have happen here? And if possible, again, we want to make sure that we satisfy each person's preferences if we can. 3, we're going to identify the adjustments that each person is going to make in order to negotiate a successful agreement. I want to emphasize that because in order for negotiation to occur, both parties need to demonstrate they are willing to do something, not just say something. So you work out who's going to do what and when, and you talk about it. And then you say at the end, okay, so we've reached an agreement and this is what's going to happen. And we clarify, again, the outcome that we want. Now, there are some additional parts to the last stage. One is to make sure that we encourage each other to participate, to talk hopefully about the fact that we can come up with a good outcome if both of us keep talking and don't retreat. And third, we want to schedule a future time where we go back and evaluate or measure how well we have carried out the negotiating agreement. Over the years, I have learned that in a marriage relationship, it is useful to invite people to make a deal of some kind where one person will say, here's something I would like from you, and in return, I want to know of what you want from me. And so teaching them to negotiate a reciprocal form of behavior gets them prepared to make adjustments in order to find satisfaction for something that's important to themselves and to also learn what they can do to make it work. Hopefully, here's the principle that emerges. I can get a lot of things that I want, that if I find out what is important to you and make sure you get that. Now, that might be used by some greedy partners, but most of the time, people who love each other will discover that if I care for you and serve and make sure you get a lot of the things you like, that is the best way for me to also obtain the rewards or the things I hope for from being married. The last crucial conversation that is necessary for a good marriage is the conversation that clarifies other forms of communication, or learning to talk about how you talk. I've been impressed with the tremendous power of this. I've asked couples, for example, who are in a therapy program to spend a little time each week saying, okay, tell me what you saw happen when we were talking last night. And they each share with that. Now, we may not be accurate. We may not see things exactly right or agreeable to each other. But let me explain to you what happens. The fact that we take the time to consider what the meaning of our messages might be, so the parts of the three messages we might be getting right or missing, it tells us that we care about the relationship. And this is a form of communication called meta-communication, which is communication about communication. And it allows us to improve our communication as we progress in our relationship. It is a fundamental core form of communication that gets us out of the patterns that are unhappy, sometimes boring, and quite often miserable, and moves our communication to better and higher levels. I would like to now consider this question: who are the best communicators and what do they do? Please consider making it an important goal to improve how you communicate and invite your partner to participate. Practice when you go for walks, riding in the car, or visit together on those quiet evenings at home. Why? Because almost anyone can improve their ability to communicate if they're willing to practice. And it doesn't come naturally to most people, and it doesn't come naturally to two people who might come from different backgrounds, who are different gender. They need to actually organize themselves so that communication between the two of them becomes private and their own method, which it should do, because they should have their own code. Now, while you're practicing, identify the good that is in your communication style as it currently exists, so that you can work to create the desire to communicate instead of dread it. One of the most difficult things that we do is communicate so poorly, or we communicate in a way that is so hurtful that when somebody says, okay, let's talk, it's sort of like a threat, or sort of like introducing them to an invitation to do something that's going to be painful. Be positive. Find the good things, talk about them, and share them. Show satisfaction in your partner's good ideas. It's not difficult to do. You can say, I appreciated that, or I enjoyed that, or what a good idea. And what you're doing is reinforcing and complimenting the partner that you have in this marriage dialogue. Also, learn to express appreciation for the knowledge you acquire, for the insight that is available. It might be a little humbling to realize that you're not the only one with the good ideas, and it's especially wonderful to be able to say, you know, I learned this from you and I appreciate it, and I learned it by communicating. See, that's why we do it, is to learn new and important things. Also identify any form of growth that you've seen in either or both of you. I've changed. I'm better. I've learned to talk about my feelings better because of you. I now feel calmer and less anxious because we can talk and I can feel understood when we talk. Those are high compliments, and they typically mean a reinforcement of what love is between two people. It is also really important nowadays to clarify what is to be kept private so that loyalty can be preserved. It is a terrible thing to mistakenly violate the confidence of another person, especially someone that you're in a love relationship with, and quite often it takes a long time to regain trust, if it ever can be. So it's just simply better to head that possibility off by saying, could we talk about things that we should keep private between the two of us? I also propose to you that you use conversations with each other to practice a new vocabulary, especially words that describe positive features of your partner and methods of showing and feeling that love exists. I propose to you that a proactive approach to improving good communication will take less work and less heartache than failing to actively improve it, because quite often you'll be spending more time solving communication problems because it was done poorly in the first place. Be proactive, be aggressive and opinionated about it, and make it happen and enjoy it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit FirstAnswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.